All right, let's get started. My name's Matt Herr, and I'm responsible for our server business at Centrify. So servers, infrastructure, data center, and really servers as the delivery mechanism for the workloads that we're providing to our customers, to our users. Just as a show of hands here, how many people are in the IT organization who are responsible for server management? A few? Okay. Of these people, how many people are deploying any kind of servers in a cloud-like environment? Either private cloud, public cloud, hybrid, doing any cloud bursting, anything like that? Yeah? Okay. Okay, great. So the things I'm going to cover today are really in three kind of broad categories. Some of this stuff you may have heard already, so I'll just kind of recap, I guess, in a sense, the trends that we're facing as an industry as a whole. But then I want to talk about challenges, specific challenges that we have, not just now, but challenges that we're probably going to have or are likely to change as we look at kind of the next generation of identity management, the next generation of privilege management, especially as we talk about some of the evolving scenarios. So, Simone, you want to grab the door? And then the last thing I'd like to do to kind of close out our discussion is talk about some of these emerging scenarios and how the choices, the decisions that we make today may impact where we end up in the future, and with some of the scenarios that are going to end up extending the environments that we have in place currently. Now, we have a pretty, this is a pretty small group, so I would encourage you folks to, if you have any questions, have any comments, go ahead and speak up. Let's just make this really interactive. I think it makes it a lot more interesting that way. Okay, so Corey kind of talked about some of this stuff in the last session. And in fact, I imagine that any IT-oriented conference you go to anymore, you're going to hear very similar things. Because the trends that we're facing as an industry as a whole are pretty universal, right? And I would say that, you can think of it kind of like, in the past, things were a lot simpler, right? If we think about just the experience of an end user, you might have had someone sitting on maybe a terminal, a fixed machine over a hardwired connection, talking to a server sitting in your data center that's delivering one enterprise application. And so it was fairly simple to think about what kind of privileges you had to manage or the challenges you might have had with respect to identity management might have been a lot easier to comprehend. But now, it's really gotten a lot crazier. It's gotten very diverse in terms of the types of access you have. And in fact, I think of this in terms of, you have users and consumers, really, of resources on the one hand, and then you have the resources that are being consumed on the other hand, right? And in the past, they were both very simple. But now you have mobile users, you have a number of different types of devices, you have people who are consuming these resources from a number of different locations, and it can be very dynamic. And so that makes it, that provides a lot more variables that we as identity management professionals need to be aware of and need to address. That user end, that consumer end, gets a lot of attention, right? Because, there's a bigger population, for one. That's what hits your end users when they show up and they want to use their smartphone in the office or what have you, when they want to be using their laptop at Starbucks. So we talk a lot about mobility. We talk about the cloud as, how it affects the consumers of resources. I think the other thing, and I'm sure you all recognize this as well, is that when we look at these types of trends, it's not just the change and diversity and dynamicism on the consumer side, but it's also on the resource side. So we've seen kind of standalone machines over fixed network connections transition into much more dynamic environments where you might have machines being virtualized. We see co-location occurring. We see hosting services popping up. We see cloud services. And then we see these kind of hybrid approaches where people say, actually I want a cloud environment, or I want a private cloud, or I want to do some cloud bursting. I want to have a hybrid cloud. And so the point that I would make is that, we have a lot of change, a lot of dynamic concerns and a lot of mobility, location, et cetera, going on the consumer side, but also on the resource side. And we have to pay attention to that. So what I want to talk about, what I want to focus on today in this talk, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, I think, that we could talk about. But the one I want to focus in on is really, with respect to identity, what should we be thinking about given this changing environment? I mean, it's changing, and on the one hand, it's changing very rapidly. On the other hand, it's taking some time. We've seen this coming. But I think the future is kind of here now. And I think the timing is right for us to say, okay, we've put all this investment into our identity infrastructure. We've put all this investment and thought and consideration into how we manage our resources on premise. We've gotten scared, perhaps, by how quickly mobility has taken off and our need to address our end user community. But we also know that the infrastructure investments we make today are investments that we're going to have to live with for quite some time. Just as an example, how many people are running Active Directory in their environment? Lots of folks. Now, I won't ask you how long it took you to plan and deploy Active Directory. Of course, it depends on the size of your organization. But I do know, I used to work at Microsoft, and I was in core Windows at Microsoft, actually working on Federation a few decades ago. But one of the things that we found when we introduced Active Directory was that customers would go through a very long planning cycle and then a very long deployment cycle. It was a very strategic investment on the part of Microsoft's customers, and there were a lot of smart people involved, not just from the vendor, but also from, especially from the customers, right? The IT professionals who go through all the planning about how they're going to deploy their domains and how they're going to do this in a way that they can kind of put the right infrastructure in place and continue to leverage that going forward. So it's a big investment. You live with it for a long time. The choices we make now are going to be important, and that's why I want to talk to you about some of the maybe near-term or even more forward-looking some of the scenarios as we get through this talk. Now you saw Corey say something very similar here, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but it kind of hits home with respect to what we at Centrify do, because it happens to be that all of these aspects of your IT environment are things that we touch and that we've been kind of focusing on. And so when we think about, again, it's another then and now kind of picture that I drew before. In the past, like I said, it was simpler. Your desktops. Everyone had maybe, it was really cool to have a Windows laptop. Now there's certainly a lot more going on. We had enterprise applications that were much more controlled, or let me put it this way, easier to centrally control by IT. So it was harder to have kind of these shadow IT environments pop up, or have business units or departmental deployments kind of circumvent IT. In the past, we had a fixed number of data center servers and systems in place. These were obviously expanding, right? And I think the point I would make is that we've seen all of this stuff expand. To my point before, it's not just the consumers of resources, but it's the resources and types of resources themselves that have really expanded. And that's why we've kind of been using this term enterprise of things. Yeah, it's a play on words, right? We're not talking about sensor networks and all this type of stuff with Internet of Things. But if you think about the number of things with identities that have unique properties and therefore have contextual implications in terms of the policies you set, right? That's really exploded over the past, say, decade. Well, and as that happens, what comes with that is complexity, right? When you have more choices, when you have more variables, when you have more options, you end up with a lot more complexity. If you think about, who is an insider, right? We talk about insider threat, right? What does it mean to be an insider anymore? Right? You have consultants, you might have outsourced IT, you might have vendors that come in to do some work for you periodically. Are they insiders? Your employees, they're insiders, right? Your contractors, not quite clear. It's interesting. I'm going to digress for just one second and say, we talk about insiders, and we talk about how the notion of who is an insider has really changed. I would also say, in the past, we talked about privileged users, right? And a privileged user was someone who could just do tremendous amounts of damage if they made a mistake or if perhaps their account were compromised. So we decided, well, we should do privileged account management because really what we need to do is control that privileged account. All right? So any administrator we're going to control. You know, the interesting thing I'd note, just as what is an insider has changed, I would say, what is a privileged user anymore? I don't know about you, but it seems like everyone's a privileged user. You know, it's just a matter of degree. So the approach that we take to managing privileges for our users, I would argue, needs to evolve to reflect the reality that we're dealing with on an everyday basis, right? It's not just I have an administrator. I have root. Root's the only privileged user I have. Root's the only one in my environment that can do damage, right? How many people run a Windows laptop? How many of those people are local admin on that laptop? Yeah, just about everyone. Okay. I'll just leave it at that. Well, actually, no, I won't. I'll say one last thing. I'll say local admin is root. Sounds like a problem to me. Anyway, let me keep going. It's gotten complicated. What's an insider? What's a privileged user? That's all changed. It's much more dynamic. There's more granularity we need. We need to have a foundation in place to allow us to address these types of challenges. We have very heterogeneous server environments. It's not just heterogeneous in terms of the types of servers. I mean, certainly there are a number of different platforms, right? And I think that especially as we see a very dynamic environment, there's an opportunity to leverage its heterogeneity. It's a good thing. But with this, as I discussed before, you know, these heterogeneous server platforms can be delivered in many different factors, right? It could be on a particular piece of hardware, on a tower, could be in a blade, could be, you know, some huge piece of metal in a virtualized environment. It could be in some data center across the world, run by somebody else. It's complicated. And now add on top of that regulatory compliance concerns or regulations. Now, regulations can be kind of a pain in the neck, but at the same time, regulations reflect what? Well, they reflect concerns so that bad things don't happen. But I would say they also reflect best practices. I mean, if we take regulations with in the right, you know, view them in the right light, in a positive light, right? They're good because they reflect best practices. They reflect where we should have consistency across the board. And with respect to identity and with respect to security, I think that's a good thing, right? Because they say things like enforce principles like least privilege access, right? Users should log on as themselves. They should have the rights to do only what they need to do to get their job done and no more. So if you're on a Windows machine and you have local admin rights because you need to run disk defragmenter, that might be a violation of least privilege access, because I would argue that you don't really need to own the whole machine just to run that app. So let me give you a list. This is the oh geez, I'm going to kill them with text part of the talk. So I'll try to be engaging. You know, some of the guys that know me here know that I try to loosen things up by telling jokes, but they're so bad that people end up kind of laughing at me. So I won't do that today. How do you secure and control multiplying identities? And so, you know, I think one of the challenges, and I'll say, we have this challenge today going forward, but we've had this challenge from the get-go. We've always had this challenge, right? We saw this, a decade ago in the data center when people were standing up a number of different Unix, Linux systems, right? And they were standing up Windows systems. They had Active Directory in place. Maybe they had LDAP repositories in place as well. What we had was people deploying maybe a Red Hat system, and they'd have local users on it. So manage people and etc password. They'd throw up another system, another set of local users, manage an etc password. Maybe they throw up a SUSE system. Maybe they throw up an Ubuntu system, maybe AIX, what have you. The problem they'd end up with is they'd have all these different silos of identity. Now, when we deal with SaaS applications, when we deal with servers or workloads that we're going to deploy in the cloud, are we standing up yet more silos of identity? I would argue that we are. The problem's not going away. And so the solution actually is pretty much the same, which is, you know what, let's consolidate that. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I think about policy management and the ability to define policy, to enforce that policy, and then to be able to report that the policy controls are actually in place and being executed as I intended, that requires a consistent namespace, right? And so if we have these different silos of identities, we have a plethora of different namespaces. How do you correlate that? So one of the most important things to do is consolidate identities. Okay, so here I wrote this. How do you not be the next eBay? Let me put it another way. How do you stay out of the news? You know, so-and-so got breached. So-and-so lost millions of their customers' credit cards. Blah, 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 right? You've heard a number of these types of reports coming out, month after month, and they're fairly consistent. Well, there's no magic bullet, but what I could say is, or what I will say, is make it easier. Make it easier to not make mistakes, right? Make things more consistent. Put best practices in place. The reason we have best practices, and again, I made this comment about regulatory compliance concerns, right? Those regulations really just reinforce best practices that we already know. And it gives practitioners a way, I think, to say, look, we really should be enforcing these best practices. We should put these in operation, because if we don't, not only is it a good thing, but if we don't, we actually might be hit with fines. How do you make sure that you can grow and scale at an ever-increasing speed? Right? I mean, that's kind of what's happening, it seems to me. I mean, a few decades ago, things didn't seem to move quite as fast. Now you hear people say, oh, we're moving at the speed of business. That sounds a little too marketing, I guess. We're moving at internet speed. I don't know if that's any better. Sounds like you've had we're agile. Yeah, that's right. Well, we can kind of chuckle about it, but, the fact is, the reason we have all these buzzwords that we keep throwing around is because it's reflecting reality. Business is moving faster. Technology has to keep up. IT has to keep up, or IT is going to get left behind or left holding the bag. So we need to make it easier to not make mistakes. Part of that goes with standardization, with uniformity, with consolidation. Part of that goes with, I'll throw out another word, agility, right? That comes from automation. Right? It comes from being able to take the human error out of the picture, to make it easier for us to make things move smoothly, and hopefully to make things simpler. Right? As we can automate, as we can provide more uniformity, it becomes easier to deploy principles like least privilege access. Compliance is something that I see a lot. I see a lot of our customers dealing with compliance issues. And, it can be very, very costly. And I think this goes back to, these are all somewhat consistent, right? How do I simplify things? How do I make things consistent? How do I make it easy to get compliance reports to my auditors? How do I make it easy to be able to define policies around who can do what? And, on the other end, to be able to say who did what? So we need to make compliance, regulatory compliance, repeatable. Now, I gave an example before, or I talked a little bit before about things like least privilege access, about removing, maybe restricting some rights, taking root away from a super user in your environment is the simplest example. And I just wanted to throw up a quote here to say, change like this can actually be a good thing. And the people who end up on the receiving end of this change, it can actually make their lives easier. A lot of times we'll talk to people and people bring up comments and they'll say, well, if you do this, it's going to change the environment. It's going to take away privileges that people used to have, and they're not going to like that because everyone likes having all this privilege. But with privilege comes responsibility, right? This particular Unix engineer said, I don't have root access. That's freedom. I don't have to do things outside my job scope. I can stick to what my job is, and I'm not going to get blamed for these stupid mistakes that occur, and I just happen to look like a target. So it actually made this guy's job easier by restricting privileges, but really maybe that's a negative way of saying it, by putting a mechanism in place, right, where policies could be defined and enforced consistently. Now, when you do all these things, right, this is really an argument for best practices and applying, kind of just the solid principles that we've all learned as security practitioners, then we end up, I would argue, with an environment that allows us to not only solve the problems that we're facing today, but by putting that foundation in place now to be able to address the use cases that are going to present additional problems in the future. Because where we're going is really just an extension of where we are. So put those practices in place now, because if we continued with perhaps dead-end or patchwork type of solutions, it's going to fall apart at some point. That's my concern, at least. Okay, so with that, let me talk about some use cases. And these are kind of more forward-looking examples. And I put them up there for a reason. It's really to say, I started with kind of the challenge at the beginning of this talk, right? To say, how can we look at what we're doing now? What should we be doing now so that when we look at the kind of scenarios we're going to be facing in the future, we'll be set up, right? We'll be in good shape and we'll be able to deal and respond and move faster and more dynamically. So I want to talk about 3 examples. One, outsourced IT, right? So I think we already have use cases where people are outsourcing their IT management, right? Let's talk about how that might evolve. This comes from talking to customers, talking to different people in the field, right, and reflecting some of the discussions that we've had. The next thing I want to talk about is about cloud-based servers, really. Is about allowing teams within your organization to spin up servers but still have them governed by the same set of policies that apply across your organization. And the third thing I want to talk about is multi-factor authentication. And here, this is really more about the convergence, right, of the consumers of resources and the resources themselves. How do we expect the user activity to change or to start being more complementary? So we're not looking at a bunch of siloed type of solutions. So let me first describe this scenario. And I'm going to start this first one by kind of saying, here's what it looks like. I'm going to go in reverse order with the other scenarios after this. In this scenario, I have 2 made-up companies, Acme and IT Admins, Inc. And what Acme wants to do is they want to outsource their IT server management to IT Admins, Inc. Now, when they do this, let me first talk about how it ought to work, at least kind of architecturally principles. Now, I'm not saying it has to work exactly this way. I'm not trying to pitch you a particular product for that matter. I'm talking more about conceptually, what should we be seeing when we look at a federated scenario for outsourced IT management. Now, it just so happens that I'm in a company that builds this type of stuff, but I did want to keep this kind of generic for this talk. So, in this example, we have an administrator at IT Admins, Inc. that is going to need to have access to some set of systems at Acme. And what we would like is we would like to be able to have some centralized policy that is controlled by the resource owner, right? The resource owner being Acme, that can say who can have access to these systems, when can they do it, what did they do, some auditing in place, and what permissions they should have on these systems, right? The other thing we want is we don't want this resource owner, Acme doesn't want, to have to manage the onboarding or offboarding of IT admin people, right? This resource owner at Acme shouldn't have to know about Bob or Julie over at IT Admins, Inc. They should just know, I have someone managing this. A way that I used to describe this a long time ago is when we think about these federation policies, it's almost like a legal contract. You could use that as a metaphor, right? In the past, what did we do? We had two entities that wanted to partner, work together somehow. And so, Acme and IT Admins, they would have their lawyers get together, draw up a contract and say, these are the terms, this is what we agree to, right? They would kind of create a policy that is that federated namespace between them, and they sign it and say, well, this is how we're going to work. Who's allowed to do what? All we're really doing is making this more automated, more flexible, right? We want to be able to have some policy creation happen centrally, right, that is owned by the appropriate parties. Now, I mentioned that Acme doesn't want to control, who individual identities for IT Admins Inc. Who should do that? IT admins, right? Yeah, they really are the identity provider for their own people. But what is necessary is a transformation, right? A transformation or brokering of this identity at IT admins into something that is relevant to the resource owner's policy, right? So it might be, and that sounds kind of academic, I know. It's really pretty simple. I think it's as simple as saying the resource owner sets up a policy that says, I have a role called outsourced admin from, whoever. And then the role assignment can happen by the identity provider and IT admins. Again, it's not rocket science here. It's basic kind of federation stuff. But at the end of the day, what we want to have is well, Corey showed a demo, half hour ago, right? And he showed you a user portal, really slick. You have an end user who can say, here are all my apps. Really what we want is we want this IT admin person to say, well, I'm managing servers over at Acme. Where are all my servers? Click. Now I'm into my server. I have a secure SSH session going directly into that machine, and I've done that using federated credentials. We want that to work seamlessly. So these are the things that I was just talking about, right? What is required, or what should we be thinking about in a case where we're outsourcing IT administration, right? We have a federated user wants to administer these servers. How do we broker that trust? How do we assure that we have a consistent policy that's owned by the right people, right? We can automate this through a federation service that lives in the cloud. When we automate, we can take out some of the risk from errors, et cetera, right? We can simplify our operations, streamline it, make it easier to deploy rapidly, and also have a way to kind of forensically look at it and say, well, the policies we put in place are actually being enforced. Other considerations, I just realized I left one out, well, no, I didn't. Seamless integration with on-premise. Kind of an interesting consideration in this scenario is the resources themselves are part of Acme, right? The identity belongs to someone else. So when you look at the trust relationships, the identity relationships here, right? The picture I showed you before, we had IT admins with their own directory server. Say they're using AD. We have all these local domains systems joined to AD, right? Acme's AD. So really, you're federating from one Active Directory into another, simply. So again, I think it kind of goes back to the scenario that Corey showed earlier. And when you think about this, who are the roles, right? Who are the actors involved, right? There's a resource policy owner. There is the identity owner of the IT admins group, right? That is just basically doing the assignment. And then you have the end user. And the end user experience should be very simple. It should be, I'm logged in, I can see which servers I want, I click on something, I get instant access, and all this great federation stuff happens in the background. When we can make scenarios like this work, right, we can actually truly outsource the IT, right, because we don't have resource owners managing the principals coming in, right? The IT, the outsourced company manages their own users. We have more productivity because the onboarding and offboarding can be very consistent based on policies that are set up centrally by the resource owner, right? And any kind of identity or affiliation for who's working on what can be handled over on the other end, right? So we have no mixing and matching or any kind of mismatch, impedance mismatch in terms of the clarity of who's doing what or who's responsible for what policies. And because we have kind of a more formalized system, right? Because we can really automate the way federation occurs for our infrastructure management, we reduce risk because our policies then become more repeatable and sustainable. And when they're repeatable and sustainable, that makes compliance and auditing much easier.
I think fundamental to all of this is roles management, right?
Mm-hmm.
We kind of do this as a company,
Right.
Are they supposed to be doing this? First of all, it's time.
Right. So the comment here was, biggest issue that they found in their organization has been roles management, because in going back to the example here, right, when someone in IT admins is adding someone to be, to work on this system, it actually has to come back to the resource owner, is what you were saying. Yeah. So I think that's the thing. I don't think we've quite streamlined the process enough. Yeah, another comment, question?
Well, a question, in your example here, what you're showing is server administration is being done by that remote group. Could you apply the same use case for business processing outsourcing, or have that person, or have that outsourced group be granting themselves to enter into a group for front-end access into applications to the transaction process?
Right. So the question is, let me paraphrase this, tell me if I got this wrong. The question was, well, I'm giving an example of server administration, right, infrastructure administration. What about business applications, federating access for business applications? And I think it's a very good question, because it kind of plays right into what I'm saying, which is, and kind of what Corey was saying in the previous session. What we're talking about here is, if you look at what Corey was presenting, what I'm presenting, the technologies are actually pretty much the same. The model and the pattern is pretty much the same. If I think about this server that's being administered as just an application, why would it be any different? I mean, the difference really is going to be in how those privileges on the resource are being managed. If you think about it, so I'll drill just a second here, and I'll try not to bore anyone, right? But if you think about what has to happen when we talk about a policy, an access policy, right, and any kind of brokering that's going to occur. I'll go back to the example I gave with a lawyer, right? For IT server administration, it might be, can you start services? Can you back up and restore? Can you retrieve log files, maybe, something like that? For a business application, it might be, what part of the data do you have control over? And so I think the challenges that we have as an industry as a whole, are start coming up when we get into that level of granularity. I think the first thing that we have to do is say, from a federation access perspective, right, is like, can you even get there? And then what can you do? That's when I think a system like this allows you to carry more contextual information, right? So Corey was talking before about how we use SAML tokens, for example, right? That can give you the ability to say, oh, you can authenticate, here's who you are, but we can also carry information about you that can be used to make a more dynamic policy decision in the application layer. Now, what I'm talking about is really about the server infrastructure management, and the reason I'm talking about that is because I feel like I've already got that solved. Because, again, my responsibilities are for the server infrastructure and for our products that manage privilege on servers in the data center now. What I'm saying is I'm going to take that and I'm going to extend it to support these kind of federated scenarios. So if we put the right principles in place now, you can solve privilege management, compliance, auditing, reporting, et cetera, problems in your data center now. If you put the right infrastructure in place, it should work to support these types of scenarios, because the kind of architectural philosophy is compatible. It's similar. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. It also applies to applications. Hopefully I didn't take that too far off. Yes?
My experience is this is everything working from the cloud or in the internet or thing. Probably a lot more limitations, because IT administration needs to deal with different protocols. It's just not HTTP or HTTPS alone, right? I mean, RPC, FTP, really go into the server and reboot them, disk management, IO management, so many other aspects of it, IT management as well, right? So doesn't it need a VPN access directly from IT admin to actually to do such much more critical architecture? If you leave them at the higher level, probably they can do only certain business IT functions and not all.
So let me paraphrase so everyone can hear. So the point was, hey, if someone's going to be managing IT infrastructure, they need to do a lot more than just have web-based access. They might have to use RPC. They might have to have other protocols involved. It depends on the complexity of the task they want to perform. Is that fair? And so the question then was, well, would this, something like this, just web-based access, really be sufficient? Don't you need full VPN access? I would argue that you don't, actually. And I would say this because when I look at our customer base that's managing servers, they tend to, they might log in through the console, or typically they're going to SSH. And if we can provide a web-based way for someone to have federated access to a server, where they get the equivalent of being able to open a session, then they should be able to do anything they want, because what we're seeing is they can do that now. Okay.
How are you solving the problem of having the role-based authentication causing maybe like, right now in our organization, I have contractors that come in and it takes me 1 week to get one request for them to get the right access. Next week, the server access. And by the time I'm done, I get 10 requests in to get one access to 5 machines.
Right. So the question was, how do we, if we're talking about roles-based management, how do we make that work in a way that just doesn't slow the whole system down? Because you get a bunch of access requests, and people have to confirm and assign all this stuff. Right. So I can't speak to the problem of role management across the entire organization, but I can speak to role management as it relates to server management. And what we have been working on and how we've been trying to solve that more scoped problem. And that is to say, let me talk about the centralized solution for just a second, by way of example. What we did is we said Active Directory provides a great repository for having a uniform namespace for identity and for doing authentication. So if we can consolidate all these silos of identity into Active Directory, that's the first step. What we did beyond that is say, for privilege management in a server environment, let's create a very flexible management model that allows for delegated management and inheritance of policies, etc. But let's do this in a way where then we can define roles and do a simple role assignment to an Active Directory user or group. The reason we did that was to solve some of this problem, right, where we could say whoever's closest to the problem, maybe it's finance servers, maybe it's web servers across the board, maybe it's engineering servers, for example. They should define those policies, define roles. But they're not the people who are going to onboard or offboard a user. That's typically going to be like an HR function or something. If that person can get added to Active Directory and we already know kind of a group affiliation, then we have a very clean abstraction between an identity value, like a username or group, and a role definition. And so when someone's added to an Active Directory group, they can automatically be added to roles. When they leave the company or they're fired or terminated, whatever, then those permissions automatically go away. The other way that we've worked to address this problem is to make sure that we have really good automation tools in place so that these don't have to be manual. So once you have automation tools in place, then you can build these into workflow systems or integrate into existing workflow systems.
Are the workflows built into your product or are the workflows just built around the product?
Right now, our workflows are built around the product. What we're working on is adding some more of that into the product.
And then how do you deal with services that you cannot really access?
How do you know which service you need?
How do you deal with service that you cannot hook AD to? So if you have a tier 1 server, you should not be hooking your data to your server to a tier 1 server. So how does your product deal with that?
Right, so how does our product deal with non-Active Directory joined servers? We based our solution on Active Directory. So it doesn't deal so well with servers that aren't joined to Active Directory. Our approach has been to say, let's make it easy to allow these servers to be joined, or if you have to stand up another domain to do that, you can do so. We have been also looking at, cases where, we always run in cases where we have servers that are not joined to Active Directory, but that hasn't been our focus.
So did you go to Gartner's Access ID Management?
Yeah, yes,
So they had a whole series of sessions on roles management.
yes.
And you kind of need a PhD to manage roles. And if you query the Active Directory tree, most enterprises, you're going to find hundreds, if not thousands, of groups.
Yes.
And so, you're starting with the problem.
Okay, so the comment was, and here I'm going to try to make this the last question for this just because I'm looking at the clock, okay? And we can take this up after here. So the comment was, role management is difficult, and geez, just look at Active Directory. There's so many different groups, you're starting with a problem. So yeah, I'll acknowledge that. What I think, though, is that, and what I've seen, is that people start by defining some very simple roles, and then rolling out, It's Yeah, put some aside, start out with some simple roles. The other thing that I see people doing is, so for example, we have an audit product as part of our solution set. And we've had people using that actually as a way to define roles. To say, it's almost like saying, let's put things in monitor mode, right? Let's see what people are doing. What do I care about? And then from there, we can build our roles. Because I think what's really missing is some good methodologies and tools for role discovery. And this is an area where I think vendors like us need to put a little bit more effort. Yeah. Let me talk about another scenario. Servers in the cloud. So here's the scenario. We have Acme, who has a development team. They want to toss up a proof of concept. They want to do this quickly. They need servers fast. They don't want to go through a request to IT. They don't want to have to be beholden to some policies that say, oh, these servers have to have a certain build. They have to be joined to whatever directory or what have you, right? They just want to toss these servers up and get to work. And so they want to put this in Amazon AWS. They need to provide access to these servers to people within Acme, but it's also kind of a joint POC. They might have some partners from another company. How do you make this work? Right? So before, the example I gave you was we had resources all owned by the corporation, and we had federated access from end users. Here, we have resources that are not owned by the corporation. They have to be somewhere, but what we want to do is we want to use the identities from Acme and also from their partner. How do you make that work? That's really the gist of this problem. So you want the partner to manage onboarding, offboarding, just like we had this outsourced IT admin company, right? We want their developers to be able to seamlessly log in to Acme servers. They're still Acme servers, right? But somehow these servers are being deployed in the cloud, separate from the internal data center at Acme. So here's a kind of a pictorial representation, right? We have Acme on the left using their own identity provider. We have a partner using their own identity provider. They both have access to these systems being deployed in the cloud, and the policies for who can access that is controlled by Acme, right? So hopefully this will look fairly similar to you, because we just talked about a scenario very much like this. It's just that some of the trust relationships are a little different. So specifically, what's changed? We still have the identity providers from Acme and the partner being internal. What we have, on the other hand, though, with the resources, is we have the ability to join these resources into some cloud-based directory, into something that is going to say, yeah, I have a trust relationship with Acme. Here are the only policies that we're going to allow, but we can do this in a way where we have systems that are disjoint from Acme's internal data center, right? So the variation that I've put here is to say, well, if you have a cloud service, if you integrate your identity by saying, there is a way to add, to join, if you will, right, these servers in the cloud to a cloud directory, apply those cloud policies, then we can have what amounts to kind of a variation of federated access that I showed you before. Now, my point in showing you these slides and talking through these scenarios is to say, look at the similarities, right? Look at the similarities, whether you deploy servers in your own data center and you have your own people talking to these servers or accessing them servers. Now I want to extend that, have people from a partner or an outsourced company access those servers. Or now I might throw another variation and say, well, no, actually now I want those servers to be deployed in the cloud. There has to be a way to anchor your policies, right? To say where are my policy anchor points, where are my trust points? And quite simply, at a high level, it's between these identity providers at the partner or Acme and this cloud service. So one question you might ask yourself is, well, okay, how do I make sure that I have a cloud service or identity provider, maybe it's an identity as a service provider, right, allow me to deploy in any number of ways, right? It's not just about cloud, it's about on-premise. And it's not either or, it's and. It's how do we make these things work seamlessly? Because at the end of the day, when we think about how we deploy resources or the problems we're solving for our business, we don't say, I have an on-premise problem, or I have a cloud problem. It's, I have a business problem. And I think that's what's important here. It reminds me of a story, kind of an anecdote I used to tell people about, kind of the next new thing. And cloud, in a sense, well, I don't know if it's still in the category of the next new thing, but it certainly has that hype. And here, in Monterey, I guess we're close enough to Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, where I'm from. And there, everyone talks about the next new thing, right? We have people moving out here right out of college saying, I'm going to go join a startup to do the next new thing, and we're going to make $1 million. And so you get a bunch of smart people that start up a company with the next new solution for the next new thing, and they come to you, right, customers, and they say, you're doing the next new thing, right? Right? I got the next new solution for the next new thing. All you have to do, take all that stuff you did, throw it out. Am I right? Partially? Yeah. My point here is, the next new thing shouldn't be different from yesterday's next new thing. How do you, I'll steal Microsoft's words here, right? How do you embrace and extend what you have? I gave a story before about, people spending myriad number of hours and money planning and deploying Active Directory. Why would anyone in their right mind want to throw that out? It's the most widely deployed and successful directory system in the world. We can certainly throw stones at it. We can certainly complain about it. But it does what it does pretty well. Why would we want to throw that out for the next new thing, a V1 next new thing for that matter? How do we make all this stuff work together? If you have policies and procedures that you put in place in your data center, and they're sound, and they're built on basic principles like least privilege access, how do you grow that into and expand to address scenarios like this? Because you really want them to be consistent, not some next new thing implementation. So considerations when you deploy servers in the cloud. How do you leverage your corporate identities? How do you prove compliance with your corporate policies? How do you make sure that the policies that you're deploying in a cloud-based environment are consistent with the policies you deploy in your data center? Are you applying the same principles no matter where you're deploying your servers? I think another thing that's kind of interesting to think about with servers in the cloud, and maybe something for you guys to think about, one of the things that we kick around at the office is, cloud-based servers are a little different than data center-based servers. You think? Maybe they are, because maybe the way we think about it should be a little bit different. How should that be different? Because, in the data center, we name our servers. How many people name their servers after Lord of the Rings or after pets or something like that, we used to do that all the time. In that sense, servers were like pets. Now, I'm sorry for anyone who's a vegan or vegetarian, but you could think of servers in the cloud like cattle, in a sense. You don't name them. You just want to move them around. You just want to herd them off, run them, and then when you're done, you move on. So it's kind of a different mindset. Some things to take into consideration. I think you all know and have thought about some of the benefits of moving infrastructure into the cloud, and what some of those considerations might be. What I would urge you to do is think about what that means from an identity management perspective. And really, it's not so much about what changes, it's about what can you keep consistent so that you can maintain your compliance and you can kind of streamline your operational workflows. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, before I completely run out of time, is mobile multi-factor authentication. And this one, I think, is actually easier than the other two scenarios. The reason I'm putting this scenario up here is to talk about kind of a convergence that I'm seeing. And I kind of wonder how this is going to play out. So we talked about how the world's changing. You have very dynamic, very diverse consumers of resources, same thing happening on the resource end itself. When I think about how a user, how an administrator, how a privileged user might authenticate to a server, never fails when we talk to a customer and say, well, what about multi-factor authentication? Can I use a one-time passcode? And so, one-time passcodes have been around for quite some time. What I'm talking about here is really just a variation or extension to say, well, a lot of people kind of, misplace. I used to use an RSA Secure ID token. I didn't always remember it. Sure would be nice if I could just use my mobile phone. So my point in throwing up this scenario, this use case example, is to say, Corey gave an example about an hour ago of multi-factor authentication fully integrated into a mobile experience. And what I think is interesting is from an identity, privilege management, and access control perspective, right? As a company, we talk about mobile, we talk about applications, we talk about servers. I think it really does make sense to say, well, how is a server user's life going to change or be made easier based on mobility? if we see a convergence of all things mobile into that user's mobile device, why wouldn't we see that also happen with multi-factor authentication? And when that happens, should that be a silo? Should it be a standalone piece of infrastructure, or should it be part of an identity system that you're using across your cloud, across your applications, whether they be on-premise or in the cloud, and also across your servers? And so from that perspective, I would say this mobile multi-factor authentication scenario is rather interesting, if for no other reason than that we offer it. But kidding aside, right, I think it does reflect this convergence of mobility, right, across identity management. It's not about servers, resources, apps. It's about the user. Okay, enough said. I think it's a very simple scenario. You know, someone's going to log into one of these systems. They might be required to enter a one-time passcode. Corey showed you a really cool example of how we implement that, at least, you know, where someone could enter in that one-time passcode or just press a button and have it happen automatically. So let me try to sum up a few things here and say, you know, key principles. What are some of the things we talked about? You know, I talked about least privilege access a lot. I won't beat that into the ground anymore. We also talked about leveraging existing infrastructure, existing investments, right, to be able to embrace and extend all the great planning and effort that's gone on in the past. We talked about parallel or duplicate infrastructures, right? We don't want to stand up yet another silo of identity or silo of policy management. This is what we've been trying to get away from. You know, we're finally starting to do this in a data center, and then we throw out cloud servers and resources, and we're going to start doing it again? Really? I think we know enough now that we can consolidate the way that we do things. As we do that, we're able to apply more uniform policies across all of our resources, no matter where they are. I think that's a great ideal for us to be moving for. And when we get these in place, we also gain operational efficiency, right? We put automation tools in place, we put consistent processes in place, and we get tons of efficiency. We're able to, as an IT organization, take money out of the cost center and put it into the accelerating business portion of our budget. This slide basically summarized what I just said, so let me move on. I'll just give you one last word here. So this is my only kind of Centrify-centric slide. You know, we've been around for about 10 years, and over that time, we've pulled in over 5,000 customers. We have a 97% retention rate. We're really proud of what we've done in the data center and what we've been building to provide unified identity across the data center, cloud, and mobile. The scenarios that I talked about today and what Corey showed you earlier are examples of the kind of things that we as a company are doing, because we do believe that identity is not relegated to a data center, it's not relegated to the cloud, it's not relegated to your infrastructure or to your apps, or your mobile devices for that matter. Identity is a linchpin that ties all of these things together. And so when you think about how you're going to get from here to there in the future with respect to identity and privilege management, I'd urge you to consider how identity permeates everything that we're doing, and to look for solutions that will give you that kind of consistent operational workflow as well as consistent policy management. Some slides, some next steps, you know, hit our website, centrify.com. If you want to drop me an email, my email's there. It's just matt.her@centrify.com. Love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. So thanks a lot for your time.